biting wind whipped through the desolate streets of Detroit, whistling a mournful tune as it rattled broken windows and stirred the littered sidewalks. Officer Kelly Quinn stood at the edge of the crime scene, her breath visible in the cold night air. The neighborhood had long been abandoned by anyone with a choice, leaving only the desperate and the dangerous to call it home. The distant glow of the city's skyline seemed like another world, one untouched by the violence and decay that permeated this forgotten corner of Detroit. Kelly's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the familiar markers, yellow tape fluttering in the breeze, the dull flashes of cameras capturing every grisly detail, and the weary faces of the forensics team as they went about their grim work. She had been here before, many times, but something about this one made her skin crawl. The body lay crumpled in the alley, barely recognizable as human. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and deep, jagged wounds marred the flesh, as if the victim had been savaged by a wild animal. Blood pooled on the cracked pavement, its metallic scent thick in the air. Kelly swallowed hard, forcing herself to step closer. She had seen her share of horrors in her years on the force, but this was different. "Jesus, Kelly," muttered Detective Marcus Thompson, her partner of 5 years, as he came up beside her. His face was ashen, his usual bravado stripped away by the scene before them. "What the hell could have done this?" Kelly didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the contours of the wounds, the way the flesh had been torn apart with brutal efficiency. It was almost methodical, as if whoever or whatever had done this had done it before. "An animal, maybe," she said finally, though even as the words left her mouth, she didn't believe them. The idea of a wild animal roaming the streets of Detroit, attacking people, was far-fetched at best. And yet, the alternative was even more disturbing. "This is the fourth one, Marcus," she continued, her voice low. "All under the full moon." Marcus frowned, his brows knitting together in confusion. "You think there's some kind of connection, a cult or something?" Kelly shook her head. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the full moon seemed too significant to ignore. And then there were the other cases, the ones no one else seemed to remember or care about. Cases from decades past, all with similar brutal killings, all occurring under the full moon. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's too much of a coincidence. There's something going on here, Marcus. Something bigger than just a killer with a twisted mind." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. He looked as tired as Kelly felt, the sleepless nights and endless hours on the case wearing on both of them. "You know the captain's not gonna like that. He's looking for something concrete, not this." "I know," Kelly replied, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "But I can't just ignore it. There's a pattern here, and if we don't figure it out, more people are going to die." Marcus didn't argue, but Kelly could see the doubt in his eyes. They had been partners long enough for her to know when he wasn't convinced. But she couldn't let it go, not when every instinct she had was screaming at her that there was more to this than met the eye. As they stood there, the scene unfolding around them, Kelly felt a strange sensation, like a whisper at the back of her mind, urging her to look closer, to dig deeper. She brushed it off as exhaustion, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. "Let's wrap it up here," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We'll go back to the precinct, go over the files again. Maybe something'll jump out." Kelly nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had. As they turned to leave, she cast one last glance at the body, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The drive back to the precinct was silent, the weight of the case heavy in the air between them. Detroit's streets, once bustling with life, now felt like a ghost town, the life sucked out of them by years of economic decline and neglect. Kelly had grown up in this city, had watched it change, but nothing had prepared her for the darkness she was facing now. At the precinct, the warmth of the building did little to thaw the chill that had settled in Kelly's bones. She sat at her desk, the files spread out before her, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Marcus was right. The captain wouldn't want to hear about patterns or full moons. He wanted a suspect, a motive, something he could take to the media to reassure the public that the police were in control. But Kelly knew better. There was no control here, only chaos, and it was spreading. She flipped through the files, her eyes scanning the pages, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the madness. Victim profiles, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, each detail more gruesome than the last, and yet no closer to an answer. The victims had no apparent connection to each other. Different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the city. The only common thread was the way they had died, and the fact that it had happened under a full moon. And then there were the older cases, the ones Kelly had stumbled upon in her research. The similarities were eerie, same brutal killings, same lunar timing, all going back decades. But no one had ever connected them before. No one had ever realized that the same darkness had been lurking in Detroit for so long. Kelly, Marcus's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. He was standing beside her desk, holding out a cup of coffee. She took it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "You're gonna drive yourself crazy with this," he said, his tone softer than before. "We'll find whoever's doing this. But you need to take a step back, get some rest." Kelly forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I can't rest, Marcus. Not until we stop this." He didn't argue, just gave her a look that was equal parts concern and resignation before heading back to his own desk. Kelly knew he was worried about her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The next full moon was only weeks away, and if they didn't figure this out before then... She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the files before her. There had to be something she was missing, some clue that would lead her to the truth. But as the hours ticked by and the precinct emptied out, Kelly felt the weight of the case pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that refused to let her go. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as she tried to clear her mind. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights twinkled in the distance, oblivious to the horrors lurking in its shadows. Kelly wondered how many more would die before they found the answers they were looking for. And then, as she stared out into the night, something clicked. A small detail, something she had overlooked in her exhaustion. She grabbed the file and flipped through it, her heart pounding as she found what she was looking for. It was a name, buried in the pages of an old case from the 1940s, an unsolved murder that bore all the hallmarks of their current investigation. The name was familiar, too familiar. It was the same name that had been mentioned in connection with several other old cases, always at the periphery, never fully involved but always present. A witness here, a neighbor there, a family member with a vague connection to a victim. Kelly's blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing. This wasn't just a killer following a pattern. This was something much older, much darker. and it had been in Detroit for a long, long time. She stared at the name, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of it all. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than she could have imagined. The name was Quinn, and it was her own family. The night clung to Detroit like a shroud, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the crumbling buildings. Kelly Quinn tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she and Marcus drove through the labyrinth of abandoned streets. The city seemed deserted, eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. "Sure about this lead?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the silence, though it was laced with doubt. He was scanning the darkened streets, his unease growing with every passing block. Kelly nodded, her jaw set in determination. This is where the last victim was spotted before they disappeared. If we're going to find anything, it'll be here. Her mind was still spinning from the revelations she'd uncovered, but she kept those thoughts to herself. Telling Marcus about her family's connection to the murders would only complicate things. She needed hard evidence before she could share what she knew. Marcus glanced at her, the skepticism clear in his eyes. In an abandoned neighborhood in the middle of the night, you really think the killer's gonna be just hanging out here? There's something about this place, Marcus. Every instinct I have is telling me we need to be here. Kelly's voice was firm, but inside she wrestled with her own doubts. The lead she had found, a tip from an old informant, had felt like a desperate reach, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them in the dark. They pulled up in front of a long abandoned apartment complex, its windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. The building looked like it hadn't seen life in years, a tombstone marking the death of the American dream in this forgotten corner of the city. Kelly killed the engine, and the two detectives sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the city far behind them. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. "Let's check it out," Kelly said finally, grabbing her flashlight and stepping out of the car. Marcus followed, the two of them moving as one as they approached the building. The night swallowed them, the shadows seeming to close in around them as they stepped inside. The interior was worse than Kelly had imagined. Debris littered the floor, the walls stained with years of neglect. The smell of rot and decay hung in the air, making her gag. She swept her flashlight across the room, revealing broken furniture, scattered papers, and the remnants of lives long since abandoned. "Splitting up might be faster," Marcus suggested, his voice a low rumble in the silence. Kelly hesitated, the thought of separating in this place sending a chill down her spine. But Marcus was right. If they were going to cover the ground they needed to, they couldn't stick together. "Stay close," she warned. "We don't know what's out there." Marcus nodded, and they parted ways, Kelly taking the left side of the building while Marcus headed right. Every step echoed through the empty halls, the creaking of the floorboards a constant reminder of just how alone they were. Kelly's mind raced as she moved through the building, her senses on high alert. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the file she had found. The name, her name, was like a curse, tying her to the darkness that had been stalking Detroit for generations. What did it mean? Was she somehow connected to the murders? Or worse, was she destined to be the next victim? Kelly shook her head, trying to banish the thoughts. She needed to stay focused, needed to find Marcus and get out of this place. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the building, freezing Kelly in her tracks. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned, shining her light down the hallway. The sound had come from somewhere close, too close. "Marcus," she called, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence pressing in around her. She took a step forward, then another, the floor creaking beneath her weight. The growl came again, this time louder, more menacing. Kelly's breath caught in her throat as she rounded a corner, her flashlight illuminating a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. And then she saw it, a shadow at the far end of the hall, moving quickly, too quickly to be human. "Marcus!" she shouted, breaking into a run, her footsteps echoing off the walls as she chased the shadow. But when she reached the end of the corridor, there was nothing, no sign of the figure she had seen, no sign of Marcus. Just an open door leading into the basement, the darkness inside as thick as ink. Kelly hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to get out while she still could. But Marcus was down there, she was sure of it. And whatever had taken him wasn't going to let him go easily. Steeling herself, Kelly descended the stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The basement was a maze of concrete pillars and rusted pipes, the walls damp with moisture. Her flashlight flickered again, and she cursed under her breath, tapping it against her palm to keep it working. The growl came again, this time from directly behind her. Kelly whirled around, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks on her mind. And then, suddenly, something hit her from the side, knocking her to the ground. Her flashlight skittered across the floor, plunging the basement into darkness. Kelly struggled to her feet, her hand reaching for her gun, but it was too late. A massive figure loomed over her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was a wolf, but not like any wolf Kelly had ever seen. It stood on two legs, its body covered in thick, matted fur, its teeth bared in a snarl. Kelly froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The creature let out a low growl, advancing on her with slow, deliberate steps. Its eyes were locked on hers, filled with a predatory hunger that made her blood run cold. "Marcus," Kelly whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. The creature lunged, and Kelly rolled to the side just in time, the claws missing her by inches. She scrambled to her feet, adrenaline surging through her veins as she backed away, her eyes darting around the basement, searching for an escape. But there was none. The creature had her cornered, its eyes gleaming in the darkness as it stalked closer. Kelly's hand tightened around the grip of her gun, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. She knew she only had one shot. If she missed, she was dead. She took a deep breath, steadying her aim. The creature snarled, its muscles tensing as it prepared to pounce. Kelly squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the basement like thunder. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, sending it staggering back with a howl of pain. Kelly didn't wait to see if it was dead. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted for the stairs. She could hear the creature behind her, its heavy footsteps pounding the concrete floor as it gave chase. Kelly pushed herself harder, the sound of her own breathing drowning out everything else. She reached the stairs and scrambled up them, her legs burning with exertion. She burst out of the basement and into the main floor of the building, her eyes wild as she searched for Marcus. But he was nowhere to be seen, and the building was silent, the only sound her own labored breathing. "Marcus," she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. "Marcus, where are you?" But there was no answer. The building was empty and Kelly was alone. Panic set in as she realized what had happened. The creature had taken Marcus, dragged him down into the darkness, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She could still hear its growls echoing in her ears, could still see the hunger in its eyes. She stumbled out of the building, her legs trembling as she made her way back to the car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. She collapsed into the driver's seat, her heart racing as she tried to catch her breath. She had to call for backup, had to get help. But as she reached for the radio, something stopped her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that the creature wasn't something the police could handle. This was something ancient, something beyond their understanding. Kelly sat in the car, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had happened. She knew she couldn't go back to the precinct, not without Marcus. But she couldn't go after the creature on her own either. She was trapped, caught between fear and duty, unsure of what to do next. And then, as she sat there in the silence, a realization hit her. A dark, terrifying realization that made her blood run cold. The creature wasn't just hunting her. It was hunting them all. And if she didn't stop it, more people would die. But to stop it, Kelly would have to confront the darkness within herself. The darkness that had been growing ever since she first laid eyes on the name in that file. She would have to embrace the truth she had been avoiding, the truth that terrified her more than anything else. Because the creature wasn't just a monster, it was a reflection of something much darker, something that had been hiding in Detroit for generations. And Kelly knew, deep down, that she was connected to it in ways she couldn't yet understand. With a trembling hand, she turned the key in the ignition, the car roaring to life. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The creature was out there, and it had Marcus. She couldn't let it win. She wouldn't let it win. Kelly drove off into the night. The city of Detroit stretched out before her like a dark, foreboding maze. And somewhere in the shadows, the creature was waiting, its eyes glowing with the promise of more blood. The hunt had begun. The dawn broke over Detroit, the sun's weak rays struggling to pierce through the thick clouds that blanketed the city. Kelly Quinn hadn't slept. The night had been a blur of frantic research, desperate phone calls, and a growing sense of dread. She had driven aimlessly for hours after Marcus vanished, finally ending up in front of the old, ivy-covered building where Dr. Evelyn Morgan's office was tucked away on the University of Detroit campus. Evelyn was an old friend, someone Kelly had turned to over the years whenever a case veered into the strange and unexplainable. A professor of folklore and mythology, Evelyn had a knack for finding connections between the mundane and the supernatural, a skill that Kelly now desperately needed. The building's dark wood doors creaked as Kelly pushed them open, the musty smell of old books and aged wood hitting her as she stepped inside. The narrow hallway led her to Evelyn's office, a small, cluttered space overflowing with books, papers, and artifacts from civilizations long forgotten. Evelyn looked up from her desk as Kelly entered, her sharp blue eyes narrowing in concern. "Kelly, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, rising from her chair. "What's going on?" Kelly didn't know where to begin. She closed the door behind her and slumped into the chair across from Evelyn's desk, her hands trembling as she rubbed them together. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. Marcus's disappearance, the creature, the blood. "I'm in trouble, Evelyn," Kelly whispered, her voice barely audible. Something happened last night, something I can't explain. Evelyn's expression softened with concern as she leaned forward. Tell me everything. Kelly recounted the events of the night in halting, disjointed sentences, her mind still struggling to make sense of what she had witnessed. Evelyn listened intently, her face growing more serious with every word. When Kelly finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Evelyn stared at her, the weight of the information sinking in. Kelly, what you're describing, it sounds like you encountered a werewolf. Kelly's breath hitched, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed out loud was a different kind of terror. Werewolves don't exist, she muttered, though the words rang hollow in her own ears. Evelyn shook her head slowly. Most people would agree with you, but there's more to this world than what we can see. Detroit has a dark history, Kelly, one that most people don't know about or choose to forget. Evelyn reached for a thick, leather-bound book on her desk, flipping it open to a page filled with faded, handwritten notes. There are legends that date back to the city's founding, stories of settlers who made a pact with dark forces to protect their land. They were desperate, facing starvation, disease, and attacks from all sides. According to the legend, a group of them turned to an ancient ritual, calling upon a power they didn't fully understand. They were granted protection, but at a terrible cost. Kelly leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. What kind of cost? Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper as she continued. They were cursed, Kelly. Every full moon, those who made the pact and their descendants would transform into creatures of the night, driven to hunt and kill. Over the years, most of them were hunted down or died off, but some survived, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. A cold chill ran down Kelly's spine. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than she could have imagined. Are you saying my family is connected to this? Evelyn hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. I did some digging after you called me last night, Kelly. Your great-grandmother, Rose Quinn, was one of the last known witches in Detroit. She was involved in a lot of strange activity in the 1920s, and some of it ties back to the werewolf legends. There's evidence to suggest that she played a role in the blood pact. Kelly felt the floor drop out from under her. She had always known there were secrets in her family's past, whispers of things better left unsaid, but she had never imagined anything like this. My great-grandmother was a witch, she asked, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Evelyn nodded. A powerful one by all accounts. She was involved in all sorts of rituals, some of them dark, some of them meant to protect others. It's possible that she tried to find a way to break the curse, but whatever she did, it tied your family to this darkness. Kelly's mind was reeling, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. It all made a twisted kind of sense. The murders, the connection to the full moon, the creature that had taken Marcus. And now it was all tied back to her own blood. There's more, Evelyn said, her voice grave. The werewolf that attacked you last night, it recognized you, didn't it? Kelly nodded slowly, the memory of those glowing eyes locked onto hers, sending a shiver down her spine. It felt like it knew me, like it was waiting for me. Evelyn closed the book and leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Kelly's. The curse is passed down through bloodlines, Kelly. If your great-grandmother was involved, That means it could have been passed down to you. The creature might have sensed that you're connected to them in some way. The implications were too much to process. Kelly stood abruptly, pacing the small office as she tried to clear her head. So, what am I supposed to do? How do I stop this? Evelyn sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. The curse can't be undone, not completely, but there might be a way to contain it, to break its hold on you. It won't be easy, though. You'll have to confront the source of the curse head-on, and that means going after the werewolves. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as she considered the magnitude of what Evelyn was saying. She wasn't just up against a killer or even a pack of killers. She was up against something ancient, something primal, something that had been festering in the shadows of Detroit for centuries. "I'll need help," Kelly said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't do this alone." Evelyn nodded. "I'll do what I can, but you're the only one who can break this, Kelly. The power to do so is in your blood. You'll need to learn how to harness it, how to control it, and that won't be easy." Kelly swallowed hard, the weight of her new reality sinking in. She had spent her life fighting to protect the people of Detroit, never realizing that the biggest threat was something within her own bloodline. The full moon was only days away, and if she didn't act quickly, the city would once again be bathed in blood. Evelyn stood and walked over to Kelly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, remember that you're not alone. Your great-grandmother may have been a witch, but she was also a protector. That same strength is in you. Use it." Kelly nodded, drawing strength from Evelyn's words. But as she left the office and stepped back into the cold morning light, she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. The darkness was closing in, and she was about to face the fight of her life. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, both for herself and for the city she had sworn to protect. She had only one choice: to confront the beast within and the monsters lurking in Detroit's shadows. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Kelly knew she would have to do it before the next full moon, or risk losing everything she held dear. With renewed resolve, Kelly set off into the city, the weight of her family's past heavy on her shoulders. But as the darkness grew around her, so too did the fire in her heart. The hunt was on. The full moon loomed large and unforgiving in the night sky, its pale light spilling over the decaying rooftops and crumbling walls of Detroit like a cold, spectral flood. The city was quiet, unnervingly so, as if it knew that something terrible was about to unfold in its darkest corners. Kelly Quinn stood at the entrance of the abandoned factory, her breath visible in the frigid air, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. This was it, the place where it had all begun and where it would all end. She had come full circle, returning to the heart of the nightmare that had claimed so many lives, including Marcus's. But this time, she wasn't just a detective on the hunt for a killer. She was something more, something that terrified her as much as it empowered her. The truth of her lineage weighed heavily on her, the knowledge that her bloodline was cursed, tied to the very darkness she sought to destroy. Her great-grandmother's legacy had been passed down to her, a mix of power and doom that had been dormant within her all these years, waiting for the moment when she would need it most. That moment was now. Kelly steeled herself, drawing on the power she had struggled to harness since Evelyn had revealed the truth. It thrummed beneath her skin, a living, breathing force that both repelled and attracted her. She could feel the wolf inside, clawing at the edges of her consciousness, begging to be let free. But she couldn't afford to lose control. Not here. Not now. The factory loomed before her, a skeletal structure of rust and decay, its windows shattered, its walls pockmarked with time and neglect. The darkness within seemed to pulse, alive with the memories of all the blood that had been spilled here, all the lives that had been claimed. Kelly could almost hear the echoes of their screams, carried on the icy wind. She tightened her grip on her weapon, though she knew deep down that bullets alone wouldn't be enough to stop what was waiting for her inside. But the gun was a comfort, a lifeline to the world she knew, the world of order and law, even as she stepped into the realm of chaos and madness. Taking a deep breath, Kelly pushed open the heavy iron doors and stepped into the factory. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery, crumbling walls, and darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light of her flashlight. The air was damp and stale, filled with the scent of mold, rust, and something else. Something metallic and pungent that made her stomach churn. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from some unseen leak, and the soft, echoing sound of her footsteps on the cold concrete floor. Every step felt like it took her deeper into the belly of the beast, closer to the heart of the darkness that had claimed her partner and so many others. She moved cautiously, her senses on high alert, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn back, to run. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, lost too much. Marcus's face flashed in her mind, his warm smile, the way he always had her back. The thought of what he had endured, what he had become, fueled the fire within her. As she ventured deeper into the factory, the temperature seemed to drop, the darkness thickening around her like a suffocating blanket. She could feel them, watching, waiting, the werewolves, the pack. They knew she was here and they were ready. The sound of a low guttural growl echoed through the darkness, making her heart skip a beat. She froze, listening intently, every muscle in her body tense and ready. The growl was followed by another, closer this time, and then another. They were surrounding her, closing in from all sides. Kelly's breath quickened as she turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint their location. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, as if alive, and she could sense the eyes on her, glowing with a predatory hunger that sent a shiver down her spine. And then they emerged. The first one stepped out of the shadows, a hulking beast of muscle and fur, its eyes glowing with that eerie, unnatural light. It was followed by another and another, until the pack stood before her, a wall of snarling, ravenous monsters, their claws glinting in the dim light, their teeth bared in anticipation. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as she raised her gun, the barrel trembling ever so slightly. She knew she couldn't take them all down with bullets, but she had to try. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but before she could fire, the pack leader stepped forward, its massive frame towering over the others. It was the same one she had seen that night, the one that had taken Marcus. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she saw a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of something that sent a jolt of fear through her. It knew her. It knew what she was. The leader let out a deafening howl, a sound that reverberated through the factory like a shockwave, shaking the very walls. The pack responded in kind, their howls merging into a terrifying symphony that made the hair on Kelly's neck stand on end. The leader stepped closer, its eyes boring into hers, and Kelly felt the power within her stir, rising to meet the challenge. The wolf inside her pushed against the barriers she had built, demanding to be let free, to fight, to kill. She could feel its strength, its ferocity, and for a moment she was tempted to let it take over, to surrender to the beast within. But she couldn't. If she let it out now, she might never regain control. She would become one of them, another monster hunting in the night, and the city would be lost. She had to find another way. The leader stopped just a few feet away from her, its breath hot and foul as it snarled, baring its razor-sharp teeth. Kelly's hand tightened on the gun, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out, a way to survive. And then she remembered Evelyn's words. "The power to break the curse is in your blood." Kelly took a deep breath, summoning the power within her, letting it rise to the surface. She could feel it coursing through her veins, a dark, primal force that pulsed with the rhythm of the hunt, the kill. But she didn't let it consume her. Instead, she harnessed it, focused it, directing it outward toward the leader of the pack. The creature snarled, sensing the shift in the air, the change in Kelly's aura. But it was too late. Kelly raised her free hand, her fingers curling into a fist as she channeled the power through her body into the space between them. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment the factory was bathed in a pale, eerie light. The leader hesitated, its eyes widening in surprise, and then Kelly released the power. A shockwave of energy burst from her hand, slamming into the leader with the force of a freight train. The creature was thrown back, crashing into the rusted machinery with a bone-shattering impact. The rest of the pack recoiled, their howls turning to whimpers as they sensed the shift in power. But Kelly wasn't done. She could feel the connection between them, the bond that tied her to the pack, to the curse. She could break it, she knew she could, but it would take everything she had and more. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the leader as it struggled to rise, its body broken and bleeding. The pack watched, wary, unsure of what to do. They could sense the change in Kelly, the shift from prey to predator. "Leave this city," Kelly commanded, her voice cold and unwavering. "You have no power here anymore. This ends tonight." The leader snarled, defiant to the end, but it was weak, too weak to fight back. Kelly could see the fear in its eyes, the realization that it had lost. She raised her hand one final time, the power surging through her like a storm, and with a cry that was equal parts rage and pain, she unleashed it. The energy ripped through the factory, tearing through the darkness, through the pack, through the curse that had bound them for so long. The leader let out a final, agonized howl as the light consumed it, its body dissolving into ash, into nothingness. The pack followed one by one, their forms disintegrating into the air, carried away by the wind. And then it was over. The factory was silent, the only sound Kelly's ragged breathing as she stood in the center of the carnage, the last vestiges of the power fading from her veins. The darkness was gone, the curse broken, and with it, the weight that had pressed down on Detroit for centuries. Kelly fell to her knees, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. Her body ached, her mind was numb, but she had done it. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, empty. Marcus was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought of him, of all the others who had been lost to the curse. She had saved the city, but at what cost? She was the last of the Quinn line, the last bearer of the curse, and now she was alone. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the echoes of the past, the memories of those who had suffered, who had fought and died. But Kelly knew she couldn't linger here. There was still work to be done, still a city to protect. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling, and walked out of the factory, leaving the ruins of the past behind her. The night was cold, the moon still high in the sky, but the darkness that had once threatened to consume the city was gone. As Kelly made her way through the empty streets, she felt a strange sense of peace. The curse was broken, the werewolves defeated, and though she would carry the scars for the rest of her life, she knew she had done what was necessary. She had become the hunter, the protector, and now she was ready to face whatever came next. The city of Detroit stretched out before her, dark and silent, but alive. The battle was over, but Kelly knew the war against the darkness would never truly end. But as long as she was standing, as long as there was breath in her body, she would fight. She would keep the city safe, no matter the cost, because that was her legacy, her burden, and her power, and she would wield it until her last breath.